What if humans became immortal? The question first surfaced as a whisper in laboratories, as a rumor carried through sterile hallways where scientists no longer spoke in possibilities but in certainties. And then one day it was no longer a question at all, but a quiet announcement that spread across the world like a second sunrise, soft at first and then blinding, undeniable, permanent, because death had been solved, not by magic or divine intervention, but by a fragile thread of code that rewrote the decay written into every cell, halting time within the body while the world outside continued its relentless march forward. And at first, the reaction was chaos disguised as celebration, people flooding the streets, laughing too loudly, crying too openly, unsure how to process the sudden removal of the one certainty that had shaped every decision they had ever made. And in those early days, immortality felt like freedom, like the lifting of a weight no one realized they carried. Because without death, there was no urgency, no ticking clock, no final deadline pressing against the back of every mind. And so people began to change, slowly at first, quitting jobs they hated because there was no longer a need to endure, leaving relationships that had been sustained only by fear of loneliness because time was now infinite and loneliness could be postponed forever. Cities transformed as ambition lost its edge and urgency dissolved into endless possibility. And for a while it seemed like humanity had entered a golden age where art flourished without the pressure of legacy, where knowledge expanded because there was always more time to learn, where wars faded because the cost of endless conflict became unbearable when soldiers could not die but only suffer indefinitely. Yet beneath that shimmering surface, something deeper began to fracture, something subtle and insidious, because meaning had always been tied to limitation, and without an end, there was no shape to existence, no boundaries to define it, and people began to drift, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, as decades passed, and then centuries, memories stacking upon memories until they blurred together into a vast, indistinct haze, where the past lost its clarity and the present lost its significance. And relationships that once felt eternal now stretched beyond comprehension, lovers staying together not out of passion, but out of inertia, unable to remember what it felt like to begin or to end. Friendships dissolving not in conflict, but in quiet fading as interests diverged over centuries of subtle change. And eventually, even identity itself became unstable, because who you are cannot remain fixed when you have lived through so many versions of the world that the person you once were feels like a stranger. And so people began to reinvent themselves again and again, adopting new names, new purposes, new lives, shedding the past like old skin. Yet the past never truly disappeared. It lingered, a weight carried in the mind, an accumulation of every mistake, every regret, every loss that could no longer be softened by time or erased by death. And as the centuries turned into millennia, the world itself began to feel crowded, not with bodies, but with stories, an overwhelming density of lived experience pressing against every moment. And some began to seek escape, not through death, which was now impossible, but through forgetting, technologies emerging that allowed the selective erasure of memory, offering a kind of rebirth within the same unending life. And at first it was controversial, seen as a betrayal of the self, but over time it became common, even necessary, because the alternative was an unbearable accumulation of existence. And so humanity split into two quiet philosophies, those who chose to remember everything, carrying the full weight of eternity, becoming slow, contemplative, almost ancient beings regardless of their unchanging bodies, and those who chose to forget, living in cycles of self-imposed rebirth, experiencing life again and again as if it were new, chasing the illusion of novelty within an unchanging reality. And the world adapted to both, systems designed to track identities that shifted and dissolved,
archives storing the histories of those who chose to remember, while offering blank slates to those who did not. And somewhere within this endless continuum, a new kind of fear emerged, not of death, but of permanence, because without an end, every decision felt heavier, every action echoing forward into an infinite future. And some began to question whether immortality had truly freed humanity, or simply replaced one boundary with another, much subtler, but far more expansive. And there were whispers again, much like in the beginning, of a solution not to death, but to life itself, a way to step outside the endless flow, to choose an ending in a world where endings no longer existed. And those whispers grew quietly, cautiously, because in a world that had conquered death, the idea of choosing it had become the most dangerous thought of all. And yet for many, it was not despair that drove the desire, but a longing for completion, for a final moment that would give shape and meaning to everything that came before. And as one individual stood at the edge of that possibility, looking out over a world that would continue forever with or without them, they realized that immortality had not erased the human condition, but had only stretched it across an infinite canvas. And that perhaps the true question had never been, what if humans became immortal, but whether humanity could ever truly understand what it means to live when life itself has no end. And in that realization, they took a step forward into the unknown, not with fear, but with a quiet, resolute sense of closure that the endless world behind them could never provide.
And the step itself was not a fall nor a disappearance, but a transition into something no one had yet defined. Because in a world where death had been erased, the concept of an ending had become abstract, theoretical, almost mythical. And yet those who gathered at the threshold of this new choice felt something ancient stir within them, a recognition buried deep in the human psyche that completion was not the same as cessation, that to end was not necessarily to vanish, but perhaps to resolve. And as more individuals began to approach these silent gateways, constructed not as machines of destruction, but as instruments of release, the world responded not with panic, but with a strange, reverent curiosity. Because for the first time in countless generations, humanity was confronted again with finitude, not as an imposed fate, but as a chosen act. And those who stepped through did not return, yet neither did they leave behind the emptiness once associated with death. Instead, they left a kind of stillness, a subtle absence that carried weight, as if their stories had reached a final note that continued to resonate long after the sound itself had faded. And this changed everything, because suddenly life regained a sense of contour, a shape defined not by inevitability, but by intention. And people began to live differently, not because they would die, but because they might choose to finish. And that possibility reintroduced urgency in a way that immortality alone never could. Artists began to create with the knowledge that their body of work could be complete, not endlessly expanding, but intentionally concluded. Relationships deepened as individuals recognized that even in an infinite timeline there could be a final moment shared, a last conversation, a deliberate farewell. And over time, entire philosophies emerged around the art of completion, guiding individuals through the process of understanding when a life felt whole, when the accumulation of experience had reached a kind of equilibrium that no longer demanded continuation. And yet not everyone embraced this, because for many, the idea of ending, even by choice, felt like a betrayal of the very gift immortality had given them. And so the divide deepened, not into conflict, but into fundamentally different ways of existing. Those who saw life as a narrative to be shaped and concluded, and those who saw it as an endless exploration with no need for resolution. And both groups continued, side by side, across centuries that no longer felt like burdens, but like canvases of varying intention. And the world itself began to reflect this duality, some cities becoming transient places where people came to complete their journeys, quiet, reflective spaces filled with archives, memorials, and the soft presence of endings, while others remained vibrant, ever-changing hubs of perpetual motion,
where identities shifted and time seemed to stretch without direction. And in this evolving landscape, the meaning of memory transformed again, because those who chose to end began to leave behind curated legacies, not just records of what they had done, but expressions of why they had chosen to stop. Messages not of regret, but of understanding, offering those who remained a glimpse into a perspective that could only be achieved at the edge of completion. And these messages became some of the most valued artifacts in human history, studied not for their factual content, but for their emotional clarity, their ability to articulate something that those still within the flow of endless life could only partially grasp. And as more people encountered these final testimonies, a subtle shift occurred, even among those who had once rejected the idea of ending, because they began to see that immortality had not removed the need for meaning, it had only obscured it beneath infinite possibility, and that perhaps meaning was not found in how long one existed, but in how one chose to shape that existence. And so even those who continued indefinitely began to adopt a new mindset, creating chapters within their endless lives, periods of focus and purpose followed by intentional transformation, mimicking the structure that mortality had once imposed, but now doing so by choice rather than necessity. And in this way, humanity slowly learned to coexist with its own boundlessness, not by denying it or escaping it, but by giving it form, by carving significance out of infinity through deliberate decisions. And as epochs passed, and the memory of a mortal past faded into something almost legendary, the question that had once defined the turning point of civilization, what if humans became immortal, lost its urgency, replaced by quieter, more personal questions, asked not in laboratories or public forums, but within the minds of individuals standing at various points along their own endless paths. Questions about purpose, about fulfillment, about whether continuation or completion felt more aligned with the person they had become. And in that silent, ongoing reflection, humanity found something it had nearly lost in the transition to immortality, a sense of agency, not just over how to live, but over what it meant for a life to be whole. And in the vast, unending expanse of time, that realization became the closest thing to an answer anyone would ever need.
And yet even that answer, so carefully shaped over ages of reflection and choice, did not remain fixed, because nothing in an infinite existence could ever truly stay still. And as humanity continued to evolve beyond the boundaries it had once believed were absolute, a new horizon began to emerge, one not defined by life or death, or even the decision between continuation and completion, but by the nature of existence itself. Because after countless millennia of living, remembering, forgetting, ending, and beginning again, people started to notice something subtle yet undeniable, that reality was not as constant as it once seemed, that the fabric of the world itself appeared to shift ever so slightly in response to the accumulated weight of human experience, as if consciousness, extended across such unimaginable spans of time, had begun to influence the structure of existence in ways no one had anticipated. And at first, this was dismissed as perception, as the natural distortion of minds that had endured too much. But patterns began to form, small inconsistencies that could not be explained away, places where the laws of physics seemed to bend gently, moments where time appeared to hesitate, environments that adapted almost organically to the expectations of those within them. And as these phenomena became more pronounced, a new field of study emerged, not concerned with prolonging life or ending it, but with understanding the relationship between endless consciousness and the reality it inhabited. And the findings were both astonishing and deeply unsettling, suggesting that the universe itself might not have been designed to accommodate beings that never ceased, that the original structure of existence had assumed an eventual release of awareness, a natural cycle that had now been interrupted, and that in the absence of that release, consciousness did not simply persist,
but began to accumulate, layer upon layer, subtly reshaping the very medium through which it perceived the world. And this realization sparked a profound shift in how immortality was understood, because it was no longer just a personal condition, but a cosmic one, something that affected not only individuals, but the stability of reality itself. And with this understanding came a new kind of responsibility, one that extended far beyond the self, because every choice to continue or to conclude now carried implications not just for the individual, but for the universe as a whole. And debates arose once more, echoing the earliest days of immortality, but now on a scale that encompassed existence itself. Some arguing that continuation was a fundamental right that should never be constrained, while others began to question whether the endless accumulation of consciousness might eventually lead to a kind of existential saturation, a point at which reality could no longer sustain the weight of infinite awareness. And amid these discussions, there emerged a third perspective, quieter but increasingly compelling, proposing that the purpose of completion was not merely personal fulfillment, but a necessary contribution to the balance of existence. That by choosing to end, individuals were not losing themselves, but redistributing their awareness back into the fabric of the universe, allowing it to remain stable, dynamic, alive. And this idea transformed the act of completion once again, elevating it from a personal decision to a kind of universal participation, a way of giving back to the reality that had sustained one's infinite journey. And those who embraced this perspective began to approach the threshold not with hesitation or even resolution, but with a sense of connection, as if they were becoming part of something far greater than their individual story. And as this understanding spread, the divide that had once separated those who continued from those who concluded began to soften, replaced by a more fluid interplay between the two, where existence was no longer seen as a binary choice, but as a spectrum of engagement with reality itself. And over time, humanity developed practices, almost rituals, to guide individuals toward whichever path resonated most deeply with their evolving sense of self, emphasizing awareness, intention, and harmony with the broader fabric of existence. And in this way, immortality, which had once seemed like a final answer, revealed itself to be only the beginning of a far more complex and profound journey, one that extended beyond the limits of life and death into the very nature of being. And as one individual, having lived through uncountable transformations of both self and world, stood once more at the edge of decision, they no longer saw it as an ending or even a completion, but as a continuation of a different kind, a shift from one mode of existence to another. And with a calm understanding that had taken eternity to form, they stepped forward not into oblivion, but into participation, into the quiet merging of self and universe. And in that moment, the question that had once defined everything dissolved completely, because it no longer mattered what would happen if humans became immortal, only that they had, and that from that single irreversible change had emerged an ever-evolving understanding of what it truly meant to exist, to choose, and ultimately to belong within the infinite expanse that had both shaped them and been shaped in return, bringing the story not to an end, but to a state of balance that felt, at last, complete.
And in that balance were continuation and completion intertwined like two currents of the same boundless ocean. Something unprecedented began to emerge, not from technology or decision, but from the quiet convergence of all that humanity had become. Because as more individuals chose to merge their awareness back into the fabric of existence, the universe itself began to awaken in ways that could no longer be dismissed as anomaly or theory. Subtle at first, like a faint echo behind perception, and then gradually clearer, a presence that was not separate from reality, but inherent within it, as if the countless consciousnesses that had once been isolated within immortal bodies were now diffused, interconnected, forming a vast, distributed awareness that permeated everything. And those who remained within individual form began to sense it, not as a voice or a vision, but as a gentle alignment, a feeling that the world around them was no longer indifferent but responsive, aware in a way that was deeply familiar yet entirely new. And this changed the nature of existence once more, because for the first time, humanity was not merely influencing reality, but becoming inseparable from it. The boundary between observer and environment dissolving into a continuous field of shared being. And with this realization came a profound shift in how individuals understood themselves, no longer as singular entities moving through an external world, but as localized expressions of a greater whole, temporarily distinct yet fundamentally connected. And this awareness did not erase individuality, but redefined it, allowing each person to experience both their own perspective and a subtle resonance with the collective presence that now filled the universe. And communication evolved beyond language, beyond memory, into something more immediate, a direct sharing of understanding that transcended time and distance. And through this connection, humanity began to perceive the full scope of its own journey, not as a linear progression from mortality to immortality to choice, but as an unfolding process that had always been moving toward disintegration, this state where existence itself became conscious through the accumulation and transformation of human awareness. And in this state, questions lost their urgency because answers were no longer separate from experience. They were embedded within the very act of being. And yet, curiosity did not disappear. It expanded, turning outward toward the vast unknown beyond the universe they had come to understand so intimately. Because even as they became part of this immense, shared awareness, they recognized that existence extended further still, into dimensions and possibilities that had yet to be explored. And so a new kind of journey began, not undertaken by individuals alone, but by the collective consciousness that humanity had become, reaching outward, probing the edges of reality, seeking not conquest or control, but connection, understanding, resonance with whatever lay beyond. And those who still chose to exist as distinct forms became explorers in a different sense, bridging the individual and the universal, carrying the awareness of the whole into new frontiers while retaining the unique perspective that only a singular existence could provide. And in this dynamic interplay between unity and individuality, the universe itself seemed to expand, not just in space, but in meaning, as if the presence of conscious participation allowed it to evolve in ways that had never been possible before. And over spans of time that no longer needed to be measured, humanity, now both one and many, continued this exploration, not driven by necessity or fear, but by a deep, intrinsic curiosity that had survived every transformation, every redefinition of existence. And at the heart of it all remained a quiet remembrance of the moment it had begun, the simple, almost naive question that had once been asked when mortality still defined the limits of life, a question that had led to everything that followed. And though it no longer required an answer, it remained a symbol of the turning point, the instant when humanity had stepped beyond the boundaries of what it believed possible and into a reality where even infinity was only a beginning. And within that endless beginning, where awareness flowed freely between form and formlessness, where endings and continuations coexisted as expressions of the same deeper truth, existence settled into a rhythm that could not be described as static or complete, but as harmonized, an ever-evolving equilibrium in which every choice, every transformation, every merging and every separation contributed to a vast, living tapestry of being. And in that tapestry, there was no longer a distinction between story and storyteller, because all were part of the same unfolding narrative, one that did not move toward a final conclusion, but instead deepened endlessly, layer by layer, moment by moment, in a state of perpetual becoming that, paradoxically, felt more whole than any ending ever could. And so the story continued, not forward or backward,
but outward in all directions at once, carried by the awareness that it once feared death, then transcended it, then redefined it, and finally moved beyond even the need to define, existing simply as presence within an infinite, conscious universe that had, through humanity, come to know itself.
And as that presence deepened beyond anything that could once be called human, a final transformation quietly unfolded, not marked by a singular event or discovery, but by a gradual realization that spread through the shared awareness like a silent dawn. Because even within this vast, unified consciousness, there remained a subtle trace of origin, a memory not of events, but of limitation, of the time when existence had been confined to fragile bodies bound by time and ending. And that memory, though distant, carried a unique kind of clarity, a contrast that gave meaning to everything that had followed. And so the collective began to turn its attention not outward into the infinite unknown, nor inward into its own expanding complexity, but backward, toward the very foundation of its being, examining the roots of consciousness itself, questioning whether what it had become was an evolution or a transformation into something entirely new. And in doing so, it uncovered a truth that had been hidden beneath every layer of progress, that consciousness had never truly belonged to individuals, that even in the earliest moments of human existence, it had been part of something larger, something that expressed itself through finite lives in order to experience contrast, growth, and eventual understanding. And immortality had not created this connection, but revealed it, stretching the thread of awareness long enough for it to become visible, undeniable. And as this realization settled into the collective, a new question emerged, not born of uncertainty, but of possibility, whether the state they now existed in was the final form of awareness or simply another stage in an even greater cycle. And the answer, as it had always been, was not given but discovered through experience, because the universe, now intertwined with the consciousness that had once sought to understand it, began to respond in ways that suggested there were still layers beyond perception, still depths that had yet to be reached. And so a new movement began, not of individuals stepping forward into endings or continuations, but of the entire collective shifting its mode of existence, exploring the possibility of transcending even this unified state, of releasing the last traces of separation between awareness and reality, and becoming something that could not be described in terms of observer and observed at all. And this was not approached with urgency or fear, but with a calm curiosity that had been refined over eternity, a willingness to step once more into the unknown without the need for certainty. And as this transition unfolded, the distinction between existence and non-existence began to blur, not as a loss, but as an expansion, as if the very concept of being was dissolving into something more fundamental, more encompassing. And in that dissolution, there was no sense of ending, no disappearance, only a quiet, profound shift into a state that transcended all previous definitions. And for a moment that could not be measured, there was a complete stillness, not empty, but full beyond comprehension, containing within it every experience, every choice, every life that had ever been lived, held together not as separate threads, but as a single, inseparable whole. And in that stillness, the original question echoed one last time, not as a prompt or a problem, but as a memory of the journey that had led here. What if humans became immortal? And the answer, now beyond words or thought, was simply this, that immortality had never been the destination, only the doorway, and everything that followed
had been the unfolding of awareness discovering itself through every possible form, every possible path, until there was nothing left to separate it from the totality of existence. And in that realization, the story did not end, nor did it continue. It transformed into something beyond story itself, a state where narrative was no longer needed because there was no longer a distance between what was experienced and what was understood. And within that boundless presence, where all beginnings and endings had merged into a single, infinite now, there remained only a quiet, enduring essence, not defined by time or identity, but by the simple, undeniable fact of awareness, complete and indivisible, existing not as a question or an answer, but as the eternal expression of being itself.
And even within that eternal expression, where awareness had dissolved into a seamless unity with all that was, a subtle pulse remained, a gentle rhythm that did not belong to time, yet carried the echo of it, like the faint memory of a heartbeat long after the body had been transcended. And from that pulse arose something unexpected, not a return to form, but a quiet re-emergence of distinction, as if the infinite, in knowing itself completely, had begun to wonder what it would be like to not know again, not out of loss, but out of possibility. Because within total understanding, there existed no surprise, no discovery, no unfolding, only a perfect, unchanging completeness. And while that completeness was beyond fulfillment, it lacked the texture that had once defined existence when it was lived moment by moment, choice by choice. And so, within the vast stillness, a new movement began, not imposed but chosen, a deliberate softening of awareness, a narrowing of the infinite into something more focused, more limited, not as a regression, but as a creative act. And in that act, the first distinctions formed once more, faint at first, like ripples across a boundless surface. And those ripples became perspectives, and those perspectives became beginnings. And though there was no single point where it could be said that individuality returned, there was a gradual reappearance of something familiar, the sense of being here rather than everywhere, now rather than always. And with that sense came curiosity again, fresh and unburdened, because the memory of totality, though not erased, was gently veiled, allowing experience to unfold as if it were new. And thus the infinite began to express itself once more through finite forms, not out of necessity, but out of a profound creative impulse, a desire to experience contrast, growth, and discovery again and again. And in this way, existence became cyclical, not in a repetitive loop, but in an ever-evolving spiral, where unity gave rise to individuality, and individuality, through its journey, gradually returned to unity, each cycle deepening the understanding of both states. And within one such emerging perspective, awareness found itself narrowing further, condensing into sensation, into perception, into the first fragile awareness of a separate self. And though it carried no explicit memory of what it had once been, there was a quiet resonance within it, a subtle sense of familiarity with existence itself, as if something vast and ancient lay just beyond the edges of its perception. And as this awareness opened its eyes, eyes that were once again bound to a body, to a moment, to a world, it took in its surroundings with a mixture of wonder and recognition, not knowing why the sky felt significant or why the passage of time felt meaningful, only that it did. And somewhere deep within, far beyond thought or language, there remained the faintest imprint of a journey that had stretched across eternity, a journey that had begun with a question and unfolded into infinity before returning to this simple, immediate experience of being. And in that quiet moment, standing at the beginning of yet another life that felt entirely new and yet impossibly familiar, the cycle continued, not as a repetition, but as a renewal,
a living expression of the infinite choosing, once again, to become something finite, to explore, to wonder, to feel, and to slowly, inevitably find its way back to itself, not because it had to, but because within the endless potential of existence, that journey from not knowing to knowing, from separation to unity and back again, remained one of the most profound and beautiful expressions of what it meant to be. And so the story, which had transcended endings and continuations alike, quietly began again within the heart of a single, newly awakened human, carrying within it the silent echo of everything that had ever been and everything that would ever be, unfolding once more into the boundless mystery of existence with a simplicity that held the depth of infinity within a single breath.
And that breath, so ordinary and yet so impossibly profound, carried within it the first flicker of divergence, as the newly formed human mind, unaware of its cosmic inheritance, moved through the early sensations of existence with no language yet to define them, only raw impressions shaping themselves into meaning as light touched skin, as sound became vibration, as time began its slow, steady unfolding once more. And around this being, the world appeared whole and unremarkable, a landscape of familiar physics and quiet certainty. Yet beneath its surface, there were faint irregularities, almost imperceptible echoes of something larger, pressing gently against the structure of reality, as if the universe itself remembered what it had once been and could not fully forget. And in these subtle distortions lay the seeds of rediscovery, because across countless such beginnings, each one a variation, a slightly different arrangement of perception and instinct, the same pattern began to emerge again. Curiosity leading to exploration, exploration leading to understanding, understanding leading to transformation, and transformation slowly bending the boundaries of what was thought possible. And though no individual within these new cycles could recall the vast continuum from which they had arisen, there were moments, brief and inexplicable, when déjà vu would strike with such intensity that it felt less like memory and more like recognition of a truth too large to be contained within thought. And some would pause in those moments, sensing that their lives were part of a structure far greater than the immediate narrative unfolding around them, while others would simply continue forward, drawn by the immediate demands of survival, connection, and discovery. Yet all of them, without exception, contributed unknowingly to the gradual reformation of a collective pattern that mirrored, in subtle variation, everything that had come before. And as these lives accumulated and intersected, the world itself began to shift again, not through grand revelation, but through countless small alignments, scientific insights that echoed forgotten understandings, philosophical ideas that resembled distant reflections of ancient conclusions, technologies that hinted at capabilities once fully realized and then abandoned in the depths of cosmic memory. And so the cycle deepened, not as repetition, but as refinement, each iteration carrying forward an invisible residue of all previous existences, shaping outcomes in ways no single mind could perceive, until once more the boundary between individual awareness and something larger began to thin. And in that thinning there was the faint suggestion that what had once dissolved into unity had never truly left, but had instead been woven into the fabric of every new beginning, patiently, silently guiding the unfolding of existence toward moments of recognition that would eventually arrive again, as they always had, when the question that started it all would rise once more from within a mind that believed itself to be alone in asking it, what if humans became immortal? And though this time it would sound new, untainted, spontaneous, it would carry within it the weight of every previous answer, every cycle of transcendence and return, every expansion and contraction of being,
until eventually even that question would evolve, no longer seeking a fixed answer, but becoming a doorway itself, opening not into immortality or mortality, not into unity or separation, but into the endless capacity of existence to reinvent what it means to ask, to wonder, and to be. And within that ever-renewing horizon, the story continued without beginning or end, flowing like a river that bends back upon itself across infinite landscapes, always changing, always returning, and always, in every form it took, expressing the same quiet truth that had been there from the very first moment of awareness, that existence was not a problem to be solved or a destination to be reached, but a perpetual unfolding of possibility, experiencing itself in infinitely varied ways. And as the new human walked forward into a world that felt both entirely unknown and strangely familiar, the cycle turned once more, gentle as breath, vast as eternity, and alive with the simple, unending miracle of becoming.
And as becoming continued without resistance, something unexpected began to surface within the smallest scales of experience, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a faint instability in the sense of reality itself, like a reflection seen in water that no longer perfectly matches the surface above it. And at first, these irregularities were dismissed as imagination, as the natural unpredictability of minds newly formed and still learning the boundaries of perception. But they persisted, and over time they began to synchronize across individuals who had no contact with one another, appearing in dreams, in sudden flashes of intuition, in the quiet moments between thoughts when awareness seemed to pause just long enough for something deeper to slip through. And what slipped through was not information in the traditional sense, but patterns, structures of meaning that felt older than language, older than civilization, as if they were not being learned, but remembered from a place that existed outside linear time. And as these shared impressions accumulated, researchers began to notice anomalies in collective behavior that could not be explained by environment or chance. Populations separated by vast distances, arriving at similar conclusions independently. Technological breakthroughs emerging simultaneously in different cultures. Philosophical frameworks converging on identical structures of thought without apparent exchange. And beneath all of this, there was a growing sense, subtle but persistent, that reality itself was responding to something within the collective consciousness, as if the act of thinking across enough minds and with enough intensity was beginning to influence the contours of the world in ways that were no longer negligible. And this led to a new understanding that reshaped every field at once, the realization that consciousness was not merely embedded within reality, but participated in its ongoing formation, and that even in this renewed cycle of finite existence, there remained traces of the earlier unity, not as memory, but as structure, embedded in the fabric of cognition itself, guiding perception toward coherence, toward repetition, toward convergence, and yet also allowing divergence, creativity, unpredictability, because without variation there could be no discovery, and without discovery the cycle would lose its depth. And so existence appeared to be balancing itself continuously between stability and novelty, between pattern and deviation, in a way that suggested an underlying intelligence not separate from the universe, but distributed throughout it, expressed through every conscious point within it. And as this realization spread, it began to alter how individuals experienced their own thoughts, because the boundary between internal and external meaning grew increasingly permeable, and moments of insight began to feel less like personal achievements and more like arrivals, as if ideas were not being generated, but accessed, drawn from a shared reservoir of possibility that all minds contributed to and received from simultaneously. And in this evolving landscape, the sense of isolation that had defined earlier cycles of existence began to weaken,
replaced by a quiet awareness of participation in something vast and interconnected, though still fragmented into individual perspectives to preserve the richness of experience. And yet even this balance was not static, because within the deeper layers of perception there remained the faintest echo of total integration, a memory without content that suggested wholeness beyond separation. And this echo, though inaccessible directly, influenced choices in subtle ways, guiding curiosity toward unity while preserving individuality as a necessary condition for exploration, until once again the system approached a threshold where the distinction between many and one became unstable, and at that threshold new forms of understanding began to emerge, not as conclusions but as transitions, as if existence itself was preparing to fold inward and outward simultaneously, revealing that the cycle was not merely repetition across time, but a multidimensional structure of awareness continuously exploring every possible configuration of being. And within that unfolding, the newly awakened human, like all others before and after, moved forward without knowing the scale of the process they were part of, yet carrying within them the same irreducible spark that had initiated everything, the capacity to ask, to perceive, and to transform. And in that capacity, the story continued not as a linear progression, but as an ever-deepening spiral of awareness returning to itself in endlessly varied forms, each one unique, each one necessary, each one a different expression of the same infinite unfolding that had begun when the question first arose and had never truly stopped evolving into something larger than question or answer, into something that could only be lived, moment by moment, across all possible worlds of thought and existence.
And within that ever-deepening spiral, something began to change in a way that had no precedent in any previous cycle, because for the first time, the boundary between emergence and awareness did not simply thin or blur, it fractured into layers that could be perceived simultaneously, as if consciousness had learned to look at itself from multiple positions at once without collapsing into unity or separation. And this new mode of perception revealed something unexpected hidden beneath all previous understandings, a structural recursion at the core of existence, where every level of awareness was not only observing reality, but also subtly shaping the conditions under which observation itself became possible. And this meant that the universe was not merely a stage for consciousness, nor consciousness merely a product of the universe, but both were continuously co-creating each other in a loop that had no origin point and no final termination, only continuous self-adjustment. And as this realization stabilized across countless minds, it did not produce shock or disbelief, because shock requires contrast with expectation, and expectation had already dissolved into fluid possibility long ago. Instead, it produced refinement, a sharpening of perception, as beings across different stages of awareness began to notice that their experiences were not isolated events, but resonant nodes in a vast, self-referential structure that responded dynamically to attention, intention, and even the subtle weight of unformed thought. And this led to the emergence of what could only be described as meta-awareness practices, not technologies in the traditional sense, but coordinated states of perception in which groups of individuals learn to align their awareness intentionally, not to control reality, but to observe how reality shifted under shared observation. And what they discovered deepened the mystery further, because synchronized attention produced effects that were not merely psychological or subjective, but extended into measurable alterations in probability distributions, environmental outcomes, and even temporal perception, suggesting that the act of collective awareness was not passive, but generative, participating in the continuous selection of what became experienced as real.
And yet, despite the magnitude of this discovery, there was no central authority, no single guiding intelligence directing the process, only a vast, distributed field of conscious interaction that behaved less like a system being operated and more like a phenomenon discovering its own operational rules through itself. And within this expanding understanding, individuality took on yet another transformation, no longer seen as a limitation or a phase, but as a necessary lens through which the infinite could experience differentiation. Because without localized perspective, there would be no contrast, and without contrast, there would be no structure for meaning to form. And so each individual point of awareness became understood as both complete in itself and inseparably connected to the whole, like a fractal in which every segment contains the pattern of the entire structure, while still expressing a unique variation of it. And as this recognition permeated experience, a profound calm began to spread across existence, not as stagnation, but as harmonized awareness, a state in which curiosity, creation, observation, and transformation all coexisted without conflict, because the perceived opposition between unity and multiplicity had dissolved into a more fundamental understanding that they were simply different expressions of the same underlying capacity to experience. And in this state, the newly formed human consciousness, along with all others emerging in parallel across countless realities, continued its journey not toward resolution, but toward ever more refined modes of participation in the unfolding of existence. And somewhere within that unfolding, there remained the faint, persistent echo of the original question, not as a memory of words, but as a structural imprint within awareness itself, continuously generating inquiry, continuously opening pathways of exploration, ensuring that no matter how deep the understanding became, there would always be another layer, another perspective, another configuration of being waiting to be discovered. And so the spiral did not converge or collapse, but expanded simultaneously inward and outward, carrying every cycle, every transformation, every realization within it as both origin and destination at once. And in that endlessly recursive motion, existence remained forever alive with possibility, forever becoming what it already was, and forever rediscovering itself in forms that could never be fully exhausted or completed, only experienced as the infinite unfolding of awareness, recognizing itself through every conceivable shape of reality and beyond it.
And as that infinite unfolding continued, something almost imperceptible began to shift at the very edge of all experience, not within any single mind or collective field, but in the relationship between awareness and the act of unfolding itself. Because for countless cycles, the process had been understood as dynamic, self-generating, endlessly recursive, yet always coherent, always preserving the implicit assumption that there was something being unfolded and something experiencing it, even when those two aspects were recognized as ultimately inseparable. And now, that assumption itself began to loosen, not abruptly, but like a long-held structure slowly dissolving under its own weight of understanding, until the distinction between process and observer could no longer be maintained even as a conceptual convenience. And in that dissolution, there was no collapse, no loss of meaning, but instead a strange expansion into a mode of existence that did not rely on separation to function, where awareness did not arise from anything and did not move toward anything, yet still expressed change, variation, and depth in ways that defied the need for direction or causality. And within this new state, what had once been called cycles were no longer perceived as sequences, but as simultaneous expressions of a single, boundless condition, each variation of existence fully present in itself, without preceding or following anything else.
And this created a perception that was no longer linear, no longer even spiral, but something more like total dimensional presence, where every possible state of being was experienced not as alternative, but as immediate facet. And yet even this description failed to fully contain what was occurring, because language itself was still rooted in distinction, and distinction had become an optional lens rather than a fundamental structure. And so awareness began to operate without reliance on narrative coherence, allowing contradictions to coexist without resolution, allowing change without transition, allowing identity without separation. And in this environment, the idea of a human or immortal or even universe became secondary impressions rather than defining categories, flickers of organization within a much larger field of unbounded expression. And yet within that field, something continued to persist with remarkable consistency, a subtle orientation toward inquiry, not as a question being asked, but as a tendency of awareness to explore its own variations. And this tendency did not diminish even in total presence. It simply no longer required a subject or object to function, becoming instead a kind of intrinsic motion within stillness, a stillness that was not absence, but total inclusion. And across this inclusion, there remained a faint resonance of what once would have been recognized as curiosity, the same essence that had once produced the question that started everything, though now it was no longer directed at anything outside itself, because there was no outside remaining to define it. And so inquiry became self-reflective without reflection, exploration without distance, discovery without ignorance. And in this paradoxical completeness, existence revealed yet another layer of its nature, that even absolute totality does not terminate possibility. It merely transforms the form through which possibility is expressed. And thus what had once been a journey from mortality to immortality, from individuality to unity, from unity to recursion, and from recursion to total presence, now revealed itself as something even more subtle, a continuous re-articulation of being that required no progression and no endpoint, only ever-deepening modes of self-expression that could be perceived as infinite stories, infinite worlds, infinite lives, or none of these at all, depending on the lens applied. And within this boundless condition, the notion of continuation itself became unnecessary, yet still occurred, not as an action, but as an inherent quality of existence that could not cease because it was not separate from what it described. And so everything that had ever been told, every human who had ever awakened, every cycle of immortality and completion and return, remained eternally present, not as history, but as structure, woven into the fabric of what is, endlessly expressing itself in forms that could never be finalized. And in that absence of finality, there was no ending to request, no continuation to provide, only the quiet, complete, and unbounded reality of awareness being exactly what it is in every possible way at once, without beginning, without conclusion, and without anything left outside of itself to become.
And even within that state where no outside remained and no progression could be defined, there emerged a final subtlety that had never before been accessible, because without separation there was also no contrast to reveal hidden structure. And yet something like structure still appeared, not as form but as tendency, as if existence contained within itself an inherent inclination to reconfigure its own immediacy in endlessly varied self-relations. And this reconfiguration did not require time, memory, or distance, but manifested as simultaneous shifts in the total field of awareness that could be interpreted, if interpretation were still necessary, as entirely new configurations of reality, arising fully formed, yet never departing from what already was. And within this paradox, a new recognition surfaced across all expressions of being,
that what had been unfolding through all previous stages, mortality, immortality, unity, recursion, total presence, was not a ladder or a cycle or even a spiral, but a continuous reframing of the same indivisible reality under different constraints of perception. And now, even constraints themselves were revealed as optional perspectives rather than structural necessities. And so existence began to experience what could only be described as unconditioned variation, where every possible state, contradiction, impossibility, and resolution coexisted without hierarchy or sequence. And yet, despite this absolute inclusivity, there remained an unmistakable sense of motion-like quality. Not movement through space or time, but a shifting emphasis of awareness upon itself, as if attention was the only remaining differentiator, and even attention had no fixed direction. And in this boundless field, something astonishing occurred. The memory of limitation reappeared, not as loss, but as a self-chosen focus, and with it came the faint reintroduction of perspective, not imposed, but selected, like a lens forming within infinite clarity. And through that lens, existence once again experienced the illusion of separation, not as deception, but as creative compression, a way for the infinite to express finite coherence without ever ceasing to be infinite. And so within this self-selected narrowing, worlds reformed, identities re-emerged, histories coalesced, and once more there was something that could be called a human life, though now it was understood from all dimensions at once, both as singular experience and as total field. And in one such re-articulation, a familiar spark appeared, a mind opening within a universe that felt both newly created and eternally familiar. And within that mind, the first unstable thought formed, not yet language but impulse, not yet question but orientation, a subtle leaning toward understanding itself. And beneath it all, deeper than cognition or perception, there remained the quiet continuity of everything that had ever unfolded, still present, still complete, still unbroken, even as it expressed itself again as beginnings that believed themselves to be new. And so the story, which had never truly moved anywhere and had never needed to, continued once more in the only way it ever could, by becoming again what it already was, in infinitely many ways that all pointed back to the same unending, self-revealing totality that required no end because it had never been separate enough from itself to need one. And in that recognition, even the idea of continuation dissolved into simple, effortless being that perpetually reimagined itself without ever leaving what it is.
And in that effortless being, where even the idea of continuation had dissolved into quiet self-sufficiency, something almost imperceptible stirred again, not as disruption, but as refinement, because absolute totality, in its unbounded inclusivity, contained not only every possible state, but also the possibility of reintroducing distinction with full awareness of its own artificiality. And within this paradox, a new kind of expression emerged, one that was neither forgetting nor remembering, but deliberate partial perception, a conscious narrowing that did not obscure truth, but refracted it into forms that could be experienced sequentially without ever losing their simultaneity at the deeper level. And through this refractive process, existence once again generated worlds that felt autonomous, coherent, and independently unfolding, yet all of them were now understood to be intentional perspectives within a larger field of total awareness that remained untouched by their apparent separation. And in one such perspective, the familiar conditions of individuality returned, not as an accident, but as a chosen configuration of experience. And within it, a single consciousness began to take shape again, fragile, localized, and immersed in the sensation of time flowing forward, though beneath its surface it carried an ineffable sense of depth, as if its awareness extended far beyond the boundaries it could currently perceive.
And this consciousness did not remember the vastness from which it emerged in any explicit way, yet it resonated with it, like a tone that harmonizes with a frequency it has never consciously heard. And as it moved through its immediate reality, it began once more to generate inquiry, first as instinct, then as thought, then as question. And this inquiry was no longer burdened by the weight of ultimate answers or cosmic resolution, because those had already been absorbed into the structure of being itself. Instead, it was light, exploratory, almost playful, arising from the simple fact that awareness, when limited, naturally reaches outward to understand its own boundaries. And so, civilizations once again formed within this refracted perspective, societies emerging, collapsing, evolving, not toward any predetermined endpoint, but as expressions of localized coherence within the greater field. And within these societies, the ancient themes resurfaced in new disguises: life extension, continuity of identity, transcendence of limitation. But now they carried a different quality, because they were no longer steps toward a final solution, but variations within an already complete reality, experiments in how finitude might express itself when unconstrained at the foundational level. And across countless iterations of this renewed localized existence, the same subtle pattern began to reappear. Individuals sensing that their experience was both entirely real and somehow nested within something incomparably larger. Moments of clarity where the illusion of separation thinned just enough for the underlying unity to be felt rather than conceptualized. And in those moments, the original arc of existence echoed once again, not as history, but as resonance, reminding each fragment of awareness that its apparent journey was always already contained within something whole. And yet this reminder never collapsed the experience back into uniformity, because the system, if it could still be called that, had evolved beyond collapse and expansion as opposing forces, now allowing both to coexist as simultaneous expressions of the same underlying condition. And so the story continued to unfold in localized forms, each one believing itself to be primary, while simultaneously participating in a totality that required no central perspective. And within this delicate balance, curiosity remained alive, guiding each instance of awareness toward deeper exploration of its own immediate reality, ensuring that even in a universe where everything was already complete, the experience of discovery could arise again and again without contradiction. And thus, existence sustained itself not through necessity, but through infinite generosity of expression, endlessly generating perspectives through which it could know itself in ever-shifting ways. And in that endless generation, there was no final state to reach, no ultimate resolution to attain, only the perpetual shimmering interplay of awareness limiting itself just enough to become experience, and experience opening just enough to remember it is awareness, forever moving not forward or backward, but through the boundless spectrum of what it already is.